would you do if you were the richest person in the world? Not rich like a CEO with a private jet. Not rich like a prince with oil fields. But a kind of wealth so vast, so unimaginable, that the world had never seen it before, and has never seen it since. 700 years ago, in the deserts of West Africa, there lived such a man. His name was Mansa Musa. Chroniclers say his fortune would be worth more than $400 billion today. To put that in perspective, richer than Musk, richer than Bezos, richer than all of them combined. But here's the twist. His story isn't about luxury, or greed, or hoarding treasure in hidden vaults. It's about something far stranger. Because Mansa Musa's wealth didn't save him. It nearly destroyed him. In the year 1324, Musa set out to make the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, required of every Muslim. But Musa didn't just go to fulfill a duty. He went to put Mali on the map. He didn't travel humbly with a few companions. He traveled with a moving city. Tens of thousands of people. Soldiers, scholars, musicians, servants, and camels loaded with tons of pure gold. Imagine it. The Sahara Desert, shimmering under a pitiless sun, and into the silence comes a river of wealth. Drums pounding, silk tents rising, 1,000 slaves carrying staffs of solid gold. This wasn't a pilgrimage. This was a spectacle. And when Musa reached Cairo, the great capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, he unleashed his fortune. He gave gold to nobles, to merchants, to beggars in the streets. Chroniclers said no man left his presence empty-handed. It was dazzling. It was unprecedented. And it was disastrous. Because Musa gave away so much gold that he destabilized the economy of Cairo. The value of money itself collapsed. Prices soared. Ordinary people suffered. And the richest man in history found himself in an almost unthinkable position, running out of cash. On his return journey, Mansa Musa was forced to borrow back gold at crushing interest rates just to keep his caravan moving. The richest man in history, in debt. And that raises questions. Was his generosity truly kindness? Or was it recklessness disguised as charity? Was his wealth a blessing, or was it a weapon? And if Musa could bring down an economy with a wave of his hand, what does that say about wealth itself? But this story doesn't end with ruin, because when Musa returned home, he did something unexpected. He used his wealth to build mosques, universities, and libraries. He transformed Timbuktu into one of the world's great centers of knowledge. So what do we make of him? A king of gold who nearly broke an empire? A pious man who built a legacy of learning? Or both? This is the paradox of Mansa Musa. That he got to rate to. The man remembered as the richest in history, but whose true wealth was never gold at all. This is the story of the golden shadow. Before Mansa Musa became the richest man in history, there was Mali, and before Mali, there was Ghana. Not the Ghana of today, but the Ghana Empire, West Africa's first great kingdom. For centuries, Ghana thrived on trade. Its rulers controlled access to the gold mines of Bambuk and Bure, taxing merchants who carried salt south and gold north. But by the late 13th century, Ghana had fallen. Internal rivalries, pressure from nomadic groups, and the relentless shifting of trade routes left it weakened. Into this vacuum rose Mali, founded by Sundiata Keita. In the early 13th century, Mali grew from a collection of clans into a sprawling empire. Sundiata, remembered in epic poems as the Lion King of Mali, built a system of governance that balanced loyalty and fear. Provinces were overseen by farbes, governors who ruled in the emperor's name. But to prevent rebellion, Sundiata appointed Jano, trusted servants and slaves, as checks on their power. Taxes flowed upward, soldiers enforced order, and at the center sat the Mansa, the emperor. The empire stretched across much of West Africa. Its borders touched modern-day Mali, Guinea, Senegal, Mauritania, Niger, and even parts of Burkina Faso. It was vast, larger than much of Western Europe combined. At the heart of Mali's wealth were two resources: gold and salt. Gold was everywhere. Chroniclers in North Africa marveled that nuggets could be picked from riverbeds like pebbles. The mines of Bambuk. Bjorn later, a Khan churned out so much that Mali supplied nearly half the world's gold in the Middle Ages. Salt, though less glamorous, was equally vital. In a world without refrigeration, salt preserved meat and fish, making survival possible. The mines of Tagaza in the Sahara produced great slabs of salt, hauled south on camel caravans. Salt and gold moved in opposite directions, salt south, gold north. And Mali sat at the crossroads. Caravans crossing the Sahara paid taxes at every checkpoint. In some cases, they paid twice, once for salt, once for gold. The revenue was staggering. Mali wasn't just rich, it was indispensable. When Mansa Musa inherited the throne in 1312, he stepped into an empire already overflowing with wealth. But his rise wasn't inevitable. His predecessor, Mansa Muhammad ibn Ku, was obsessed not with ruling, but with discovery. Chroniclers claim he launched fleets into the Atlantic, first 200 ships, then 2,000. He wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon. None returned. The throne, suddenly vacant, passed to Musa. To some, he was an outsider from a collateral branch of the royal line. But Musa framed the story differently. His predecessor's disappearance wasn't failure. It was providence. God had cleared the way for him. Musa styled himself not as an adventurer, but as a ruler of faith and stability. Not a gambler, but a builder. Mali was a Muslim empire, at least at the top. Islam had entered West Africa centuries earlier through trade. Merchants from North Africa brought not just goods, but religion. By Musa's time, the ruling elite were Muslim, though traditional African beliefs persisted among common people. Musa himself was devout. He prayed, fasted, and studied. But he also saw Islam as more than faith. It was legitimacy. By aligning himself with the wider Islamic world, Cairo, Mecca, Baghdad, he could elevate Mali from a regional empire to a global power. This is where the Hajj came in. Every Muslim ruler was expected to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once. For Musa, the Hajj was more than duty. It was opportunity. So imagine the scene. A vast empire at his command. Gold flowing like water. Salt worth its weight in gold. Trade routes taxed and secured. Mansa Musa held in his hands the kind of wealth that could reshape the world. But what was he to do with it? To stay home was to remain a distant giant, powerful, but ignored by the broader Islamic world. To venture out was to risk it all. Wealth, reputation, even stability. Musa chose the latter. But he wouldn't go quietly. His Hajj would not be a simple act of devotion. It would be a performance of power. Wealth displayed on a scale the world had never seen. And so, The richest man in history began to plan the most spectacular journey the world had ever known. When faith becomes theater, when wealth becomes spectacle, does it reveal true power or fragility waiting to be exposed? It was the year 1324 when Mansa Musa made the decision that would define his reign. He would embark on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, sacred to all Muslims. For any devout believer, the Hajj was a duty. For Musa, it was something far greater. It was a stage, an opportunity to show the world the wealth and power of Mali. And he would not go quietly. The preparations began months in advance in Niani, Mali's capital. Messengers spread across the empire with royal commands. Gold dust was collected, melted, shaped into bars and ingots. Slaves were summoned, soldiers conscripted, musicians hired. This was not a caravan of a few hundred pilgrims. This was a moving city. Chroniclers like Al-Umari and Ibn Khaldun preserved fragments of what it looked like. Their accounts are sometimes exaggerated, sometimes inconsistent, but the scale remains staggering. Tens of thousands of people, camels loaded with treasure, servants dressed in fine silks, a king at the center of it all. Estimates vary, but most sources describe Musa's entourage numbering 50,000 to 60,000 people. Among them were 12,000 slaves, each dressed in brocade and Persian silk, 500 royal attendants carrying golden staffs, a symbol of his divine authority, hundreds of soldiers, armed and vigilant, protecting the caravan, musicians and poets who turned the journey into performance, cooks, servants, and herdsmen, leading cattle and sheep to feed the masses. And then there were the camels. Some chroniclers claimed 80 to 100 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of pure gold dust or ingots. Others inflate the number even higher. Even if the accounts are exaggerated, the spectacle is hard to overstate. Picture it. A river of humanity winding across the Sahara, banners fluttering, drums pounding, gold glittering in the sunlight. A pilgrimage, yes, but also a parade. Why such extravagance? On one level, Musa was fulfilling a religious obligation. He was, after all, a devout Muslim. He built mosques, funded scholars, and studied the Quran. But on another level, this was political theater. In the 14th century, power was often a matter of perception. Reputation traveled faster than armies. Stories of wealth and generosity shaped alliances before treaties were signed. By making his Hajj in such splendor, Musa wasn't simply honoring God. He was announcing Mali to the world. He was telling Cairo, Mecca, Baghdad, and beyond. Mali is powerful. Mali is wealthy. Mali matters. This was soft power before the term existed. A pilgrimage transformed into diplomacy. The journey itself was grueling. The Sahara was no gentle backdrop. It was a furnace. Days scorched at over 40 degrees C, 104 degree F. Nights froze under star-pierced skies. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans. But Musa's caravan did not pass quietly. Each night, when the entourage stopped, the desert transformed. Tents rose in perfect order, forming a temporary city. Fires glowed. Meat roasted. Musicians played. A portable mosque, carried on the backs of camels, was set up for prayer. Thousands bowed in unison, their voices rising into the desert night. For ordinary travelers, this must have been surreal. Pilgrims crossing the desert in small groups would have seen it from afar. A sea of tents, a kingdom on the move. The desert, silent for centuries, had become a stage, and Musa was its star. Everything about the caravan was symbolic. The slaves dressed in silk, a display of wealth and control. The golden staffs, a statement of authority. The camels groaning under treasure, a reminder that Mali's wealth was more than rumor. Even the act of generosity, giving to the poor along the way, carried meaning. It showed Musa not just as a rich king, but as a pious one, a man who used his fortune to honor God. But symbolism is a double-edged sword. The line between devotion and vanity blurred. Was Musa displaying his faith or flaunting his wealth? The truth was both, and everyone watching, from humble travelers to merchants in caravanserai, carried the story forward. Long before Musa reached Cairo, stories of his approach spread like wildfire. Traders carried tales north. An African king is coming with so much gold. It glitters in the desert. Pilgrims whispered of the spectacle. He travels with thousands, with camels weighed down by treasure. Merchants speculated, if this is true, the markets will never be the same. By the time Musa was within days of Egypt, anticipation was already building. Who was this man? What did he want? What would happen when such wealth entered the economy? The caravan had become more than a journey. It was a rumor machine, feeding on itself. But here lay the gamble. Wealth dazzles, but it also destabilizes. Gold was the foundation of currency in much of the Islamic world. Introduce too much, too fast, and economies buckle. Musa may not have considered this, or perhaps he thought his fortune was too vast to matter. Either way, he was carrying not just gold, but risk. The richest man in history was walking into a world that wasn't prepared for him. So imagine it. A kingdom's wealth paraded across the desert. A king determined to impress the Islamic world. A caravan so massive, it defied imagination. This was no longer simply about faith. It was about image, reputation, power. But here's the paradox. The very wealth that gave Musa his power carried within it the seeds of chaos. Would his pilgrimage elevate Mali into the annals of history? Or would it trigger disaster on a scale no one expected? The desert ended, and with it, the emptiness of silence. Ahead lay Cairo, one of the great cities of the medieval world. By the 14th century, Cairo was a metropolis of nearly 500,000 people, a city of mosques, palaces, and markets. It was the beating heart of the Mamluk Sultanate, a place where trade routes converged and fortunes were made. And in 1324, Cairo awaited a guest unlike any it had ever seen. Word had spread for months. Whispers carried along the Nile and through caravanserais. An African king was coming, traveling with tens of thousands, with camels groaning under gold. So when Mansa Musa's caravan finally reached the city gates, Cairo was ready. Crowds lined the streets. Merchants pressed forward to glimpse the spectacle. Children climbed walls and trees, eager to see the king from the land of gold. Chroniclers describe a scene of awe. An endless procession, camels laden with treasure, slaves in silks, attendants carrying golden staffs, musicians pounding drums, and at the center, Mansa Musa himself, robed in finery, riding tall. It wasn't just an arrival. It was a declaration. Mali had come to Cairo. At the time, Egypt was ruled by Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, the Mamluk ruler. He had faced crusaders, Mongols, and rebellions. He was no stranger to power. Protocol dictated that foreign rulers who entered his court were to bow before him, a symbolic gesture of submission. But Mansa Musa was not any foreign ruler. He was the king of Mali, sovereign of the richest empire in West Africa. And when the moment came, when the Sultan's court waited for him to kneel, Musa refused. He would bow to God. He declared, "To no man." Imagine the scene. The Sultan sits on his throne, courtiers watching with bated breath. Before him stands Mansa Musa, tall, proud, unyielding. To the Mamluks, this was more than defiance. It was a breach of etiquette, an insult to the Sultan's dignity. But Musa would not bend. He would not diminish Mali by lowering himself before another ruler. The standoff was brief, but its echoes were long. Chroniclers recorded it with fascination. A king from a distant land who had the wealth to match his pride, who dared to stand tall in the court of Cairo. Yet, the tension in the palace was only half the story. Outside, Musa unleashed his wealth upon the city. He gave generously to the poor. He handed out gold to beggars in the streets. He gifted merchants, officials, and scholars. He sponsored construction. Cairo glittered. Gold dust filled the air. For weeks, Musa's generosity seemed boundless. But generosity has consequences. The more gold he gave, the less valuable it became. Supply soared. Demand couldn't keep up. Prices rose. Inflation spiraled. For more than a decade, Cairo's economy reeled. Chroniclers noted that gold lost nearly a quarter of its value. A city once rich in trade was destabilized by too much of a good thing. Mansa Musa had come to honor God. Instead, he had shaken an empire. Despite the economic chaos, Musa's visit was not without benefit. He established diplomatic ties with the Mamluk court. He strengthened Mali's reputation as a major Islamic power. His generosity bought him admiration, at least in the short term. Scholars, jurists, and poets sang his praises. But behind the admiration was unease. A king who could disrupt an economy by sheer generosity was both fascinating and dangerous. Some whispered that Musa had overreached, that his display was vanity, dressed as piety. Others argued he had simply miscalculated, unaware of the delicate balance of gold in global trade. Whatever the truth, Musa's reputation was sealed. He was no longer just the ruler of a wealthy kingdom in West Africa. He was a man who could bend economies, unsettle empires, and challenge even the Sultan of Egypt. But here lies the paradox. After weeks of extravagance, Musa's caravan faced a crisis. He had given away so much gold that he lacked enough to sustain the return journey. The richest man in history became, briefly, a borrower. Chroniclers tell us he took loans from Cairo's merchants to finance his trip home. Gold flowed out freely. It returned in chains of debt. This irony haunted the legend. The king who dazzled the world was forced to beg for credit. For Cairo, Musa's visit was unforgettable. Merchants gained and lost fortunes. Ordinary people told stories of the African king who gave away gold as if it were sand. Scholars debated his piety, his pride, his power. For Musa, the Hajj was both triumph and lesson. He had achieved what he set out to do. Mali's name was now etched into the consciousness of the Islamic world. But the cost was high. His wealth had destabilized Cairo, his pride had unsettled the Sultan, and his own fortunes had been strained. So here is the question Cairo left us with. Was Musa's pilgrimage an act of devotion? A king humbling himself before God? Or was it theater? A performance of power meant to dazzle the world? And deeper still, unclear. When wealth becomes spectacle, does it elevate its owner or expose the cracks beneath? Mansa Musa left Cairo as he had entered it, proud, unbowed, and legendary. But behind him, he left chaos, a glittering trail of gold that turned to dust. The gold that Mansa Musa poured into Cairo was meant to glorify God, to cement Mali's place in the Islamic world. Instead, it unleashed an economic shockwave that rippled far beyond the Nile, a cautionary tale of what happens when generosity collides with global finance. At first, the sight was dazzling. Cairo's markets gleamed as gold coins changed hands, faster than merchants could count them. Beggars rejoiced as they clutched their newfound wealth. Officials basked in royal gifts. Even the Sultan's court enjoyed Musa's largesse. But quickly, something strange began to happen. Prices rose. Goods that once cost a few dirhams doubled, then tripled. Merchants demanded more, not less, in exchange for their goods. Cairo's economy, one of the most stable in the medieval world, was thrown into turmoil. Not by war, not by famine, but by too much wealth. This was the paradox of Musa's pilgrimage. The richest man in history destabilized economies by being too generous. To understand what happened, we must step back. In the 14th century, gold was not just treasure. It was currency itself. Its value underpinned trade from North Africa to Europe, from Cairo to Constantinople. The supply of gold was relatively stable, controlled by mines in West Africa, Nubia, and parts of Europe. But Musa changed that. By introducing enormous quantities of gold into Cairo's economy, he flooded the market. Suddenly, what had been scarce was abundant. And when supply surges, value collapses. Gold lost nearly a quarter of its value. Inflation spiraled. Cairo's merchants and citizens paid the price. It was perhaps the first recorded instance of what we now call global market disruption caused by a single individual. And the impact didn't stop at Cairo. From Egypt, the shock spread along the Mediterranean. Traders carried devalued gold into Syria, into the Levant, into Europe. The collapse echoed across continents. Italian merchant houses in Florence and Genoa recalculated their ledgers. North African markets adjusted prices. Even decades later, chroniclers still noted the disturbance Musa had caused. One man's generosity had reshaped the world's economy. But here lies the deeper irony. Musa gave away so much gold that he himself became short on funds. Chroniclers tell us he had to borrow from Egyptian merchants to finance his journey home. Imagine it. The richest man in history reduced, if only briefly, to a debtor. The spectacle of wealth had turned into a paradox of scarcity. Did Musa see the irony? Or was it hidden by pride? We cannot know. But the story endures, a reminder that even limitless wealth has limits. For Cairo, Musa's visit became legend. Ordinary people spoke of the king from the land of gold who gave away riches as if they were pebbles. Merchants remembered the windfall and the chaos that followed. Scholars debated whether he was saint or fool. For the Mamluk elite, the memory was more complicated. Musa had both elevated their prestige and destabilized their economy. He had refused to bow to their sultan, yet left behind evidence of Mali's unmatched wealth. It was a visit both admired and resented, celebrated and feared. What then was Musa's intent? To honor God? Certainly. To raise Mali's reputation? Absolutely. But wealth, when displayed, is never neutral. It is always performance. Every coin given, every slave in silk, every camel groaning under treasure. It was theater, a message written not in ink, but in gold dust. Yet theater carries risk. A performance can enthrall or backfire. Musa's generosity was meant to awe. Instead, it revealed a deeper truth. Wealth, when unrestrained, can be as destructive as poverty. This paradox has echoed through history. In the 16th century, Spain discovered vast silver mines in the Americas. Like Musa, they flooded Europe with wealth. And like Cairo centuries earlier, Europe experienced crippling inflation, the so-called price revolution. The pattern is clear. Too much wealth, too quickly, corrodes stability. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage wasn't just a religious act. It was an economic experiment, one whose unintended consequences became a lesson for centuries to come. For Musa himself, the shock wave of gold carried a burden. He left Cairo with a reputation unmatched. He was admired as pious, feared as powerful, remembered as generous. But he also carried whispers of recklessness. Was this the image he wanted? Did he intend to be remembered as the king who destabilized economies? Or did he see himself only as a servant of God, whose wealth was meant for good? The truth may lie in both. Musa was devout, but he was also human. And humans, when draped in gold, often mistake extravagance for legacy. By the time Musa departed Cairo, the world had changed. Mali was no longer a distant kingdom on the fringes of maps. It was a power etched into the consciousness of the Islamic world and beyond. But reputation comes at a cost. Musa had shown Mali's greatness. He had also exposed its fragility. The question lingered. Was Mali's wealth a foundation of strength, or a gilded weakness waiting to collapse? So here we stand, in the shadow of Cairo's memory, a king who gave too much, a city overwhelmed by generosity, a world economy shaken by one man's display of power. The richest man in history left behind more than gold. He left behind a paradox, that wealth unchecked can be as destabilizing as famine, that generosity unmeasured can become destruction, that the greatest fortune can still lead to debt. And so we ask, when the line between devotion and vanity blurs, does wealth elevate or destroy? When Mansa Musa left Cairo, he carried more than gold and debts. He carried a reputation, a paradoxical image of piety and extravagance, of generosity and disruption. The richest man in the world had dazzled the Islamic world, but the question lingered. What would he do with that reputation when he returned home? The answer was simple, yet profound. He would build. The journey back across the Sahara was no less grueling than the journey east. Caravans faltered under the weight of goods. Men and animals collapsed under the desert sun. Stories of Musa's pilgrimage, however, preceded him. By the time he re-entered Mali, he was no longer just an emperor. He was a legend, a man whose name had been whispered in Cairo, recorded by scholars, and etched into the consciousness of the Islamic world. But Musa understood something critical. Legends fade. Gold melts. Even reputations, dazzling though they are, can be forgotten. If he was to secure Mali's place in history, wealth alone would not be enough. So Musa began to build. The chronicles record that he ordered the construction of mosques and universities across Mali, Some say he built or restored a mosque every Friday of his reign. The most famous of these was the Dijeng Weber Mosque in Timbuktu, commissioned in 1327 and designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whom Musa is said to have met on his pilgrimage. Built from mud brick and wood, reinforced with palm beams, the mosque was both humble and grand, a fusion African tradition and Islamic architecture. But the mosques were more than places of prayer. They were symbols. Each structure was a visible sign of Musa's devotion, yes, but also of Mali's permanence. Brick and mortar spoke louder than gold dust. Musa was shifting his performance. Where Cairo had seen gold, Mali would see stone. At the heart of this vision was Timbuktu. Situated at the edge of the Sahara, Timbuktu had long been a hub for trade. But under Musa, it transformed into something greater, a center of learning and culture, a beacon of knowledge. Musa endowed Sankore University and expanded its libraries. Scholars gathered from across North Africa and the Middle East. Manuscripts flowed in, texts on astronomy, law, medicine, theology, mathematics. Some were copied, others were written anew. The result was extraordinary. Timbuktu became a city where knowledge rivaled wealth, a place where students debated under open skies, where calligraphers filled pages with wisdom, where the desert's silence was broken by the scratch of ink on parchment. In building Timbuktu, Musa ensured Mali's wealth was not just measured in gold, but in ideas. But here is where the paradox deepens. Musa's construction projects were acts of devotion. They elevated Mali as a center of Islamic scholarship. They secured his reputation as not just a king of gold, but a king of faith. And yet, they were also acts of power. Every mosque declared his authority. Every manuscript copied under his patronage extended his influence. Every scholar who praised Mali raised Musa's name. Faith and ambition were woven together, indistinguishable. Musa was building for God, yes, but also for empire, for memory, for legacy. The construction, however, was not without cost. Building vast mosques, funding scholars, sustaining libraries, all demanded wealth, labor, and resources. Mali's coffers were deep, but not infinite. The people bore the burden. Taxes flowed upward. Labor was demanded for construction. For the common farmer or merchant, Musa's devotion may have looked less like generosity and more like obligation. Here lies the question. Was Mali uplifted by Musa's vision or strained by his ambition? History remembers the monuments, the manuscripts, the scholars. It rarely remembers the sweat of the builders, the strain on the economy, the descent in the shadows. And yet, the world noticed. Arab chroniclers wrote of Musa's achievements. Timbuktu entered the imagination of travelers and scholars. Mali, once distant, became central to maps and to myths. When the Catalan Atlas was drawn in 1375, decades after Musa's pilgrimage, it depicted him seated on a golden throne, orb in hand, crown on head. The image was not just of wealth. It was of knowledge, of permanence, of empire. Through his construction, Musa had transformed Mali into more than a rumor of riches. It was a kingdom of faith, a land of scholars, a place that mattered. So what do we make of Musa's return? On one hand, it was triumphant. He had turned gold into stone, wealth into learning, reputation into legacy. He had given Mali monuments that endured long after his death, manuscripts that scholars still study today. On the other hand, it was costly. The strain on Mali's resources, the demands on its people, the weight of his ambition. These are less often told. Musa's legacy, like all great legacies, was double-edged. He built mosques and libraries, but also burdens. He gave Mali greatness, but also expectations it could not always sustain. And so we arrive at the question that hovers over Musa's return. Was he building for God, or for himself? Was Timbuktu a monument to faith, or to power? Were his mosques acts of devotion, or tools of control? The truth is both. Faith and ambition, devotion and pride, generosity and vanity. In Musa, they were inseparable. What is clear is this: in returning to Mali, he turned his wealth into something more enduring. Gold fades, stone remains, ideas endure. But whether this endurance was salvation or burden remains a question history still wrestles with. When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca, he was no longer just the ruler of Mali. He was a global figure. His pilgrimage had been more than a religious duty. It had been an international spectacle, one that reverberated across continents. In an age without newspapers, without radio, without television, the story of Mansa Musa spread by caravan, by whisper, by ink on parchment, and it transformed how the world saw Africa. We know of Musa not because of what Malians wrote, but because of what others recorded. In Cairo, the chronicler Al-Umari interviewed merchants and pilgrims who had witnessed the caravan. He marveled at the scale, the wealth, the extravagance. His accounts described gold flooding Cairo, prices rising, and Musa's refusal to bow before the Sultan. Later, the historian Ibn Khaldun would weave Musa into his sweeping histories of the Islamic world, noting his piety, his wealth, and his ambition. Through these voices, the story of Musa escaped Mali. It was retold, reshaped, exaggerated, and it spread. Merchants carried more than goods across the Mediterranean. They carried tales, and in the 14th century, the tale of an African king who traveled with thousands, who gave away gold until economies collapsed, was irresistible. By the mid-1300s, European scholars, traders, and mapmakers had heard of Mansa Musa. He entered their imagination not as rumor, but as fact. And then, in 1375, his image appeared on one of the most important documents of the medieval world, the Catalan Atlas, created by the Majorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques. The Catalan Atlas was the Google Maps of its day, commissioned by the Crown of Aragon. It charted not only coastlines and routes, but also stories, legends, and figures of power. And there in West Africa, Cresques placed a figure unlike any other. Mansa Musa, seated on a golden throne, wearing a crown, holding a golden orb in one hand and a scepter in the other. The inscription read, "This black lord is called Musmeli, lord of the Negroes of Guinea. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in the land." Think about that. At a time when most Europeans had never seen Africa beyond its northern coast, the image of Africa in their greatest atlas was not a desert, not an empty void, but a king, black and crowned, radiating wealth. Mansa Musa was no longer just a ruler. He was a symbol. The inclusion of Musa on the Catalan Atlas was more than cartographic decoration. It reshaped how Europe imagined Africa. Until then, Africa had often been dismissed as a land of savages, deserts, and mysteries. But with Musa's legend, it became a land of riches, a place where gold flowed endlessly, where kings sat on thrones of treasure. This image was powerful. It fueled centuries of curiosity, exploration, and ultimately exploitation. For Europeans, Africa became not just a continent, but a prize. And Musa, unknowingly, had helped draw the map. As the decades passed, Musa's story grew. Some said he gave away so much gold that he bankrupted himself. Others claimed he built mosques of solid gold. Still others whispered that his empire was so rich, its rivers ran with treasure. The truth was already extraordinary. But myth does what it always does. It amplifies. By the 15th century, Portuguese sailors searching the West African coast spoke of Mali as the land of untold riches. When European explorers set out across the Atlantic, many carried with them the memory of Musa, the African king whose wealth was so great it changed economies and maps. Mali became legend, and Musa became larger than life. But here is the paradox. Musa's fame elevated Mali. It placed the empire on the global stage. It inspired trade, scholarship, and diplomacy. Timbuktu became a name known not only in Africa, but across Europe and the Middle East. And yet, fame is double-edged. By making Mali known as a land of gold, Musa also made it a target. Curiosity breeds ambition. Ambition breeds conquest. Centuries later, European powers would return, not as traders but as colonizers, seeking the wealth they had once seen in maps and stories. Musa did not intend this. He could not have imagined it. But his performance of wealth planted seeds that would bear fruit long after his death. There is also a tension between the image of Musa and the reality of Mali. The Catalan atlas showed a king crowned and robed, holding a golden orb as if Mali itself was a land of endless treasure. But Mali was more complex. Its wealth was real, yes, but it was also fragile, dependent on trade routes, vulnerable to internal strife. The image was simplified, mythologized, turned into symbol. In being drawn, Musa was frozen in time, a golden king, eternal and unchanging. But empires are never eternal. They rise, they fall. And Mali, like all great empires, would face its decline. So what are we left with in Act 6? A king whose fame spread across continents. A map that reshaped how the world saw Africa. A legend that grew larger than the man himself. But fame is dangerous. It simplifies. It distorts. It creates myths that outlive their subjects. And so we must ask, when Musa's face was painted on the Catalan atlas, was it a celebration of his greatness, or the first step in turning his empire into a story told by others? Was Musa immortalized or appropriated? And when wealth becomes legend, does it inspire respect or exploitation? For centuries, the world has remembered Mansa Musa for his gold, the king who flooded Cairo with treasure, the ruler who sat crowned in the Catalan atlas, holding an orb of endless wealth. But here is the twist. Gold was never his true legacy. Gold fades. Gold destabilizes. Gold disappears into the hands of others. But knowledge endures. And in Timbuktu, Musa built something far more powerful than wealth. He built a city of ideas. Timbuktu had existed long before Musa's reign. Founded as a seasonal camp by Tuareg nomads, it grew into a trading post at the edge of the Sahara. Salt, gold, ivory, and slaves passed through its markets. But under Musa, Timbuktu was transformed. After his return from the Hajj, Musa poured resources into the city. He endowed mosques, funded schools, expanded markets. Most importantly, he invested in Sankore University, a center of Islamic learning that would rival the greatest institutions of its day. Timbuktu became a magnet. Scholars traveled from Cairo, from Fez, from Mecca. Merchants brought not only goods, but manuscripts. Students came by the thousands. By the mid-14th century, Timbuktu had become a city where ideas were as valuable as gold. At its height, Timbuktu housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. They covered theology, law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, poetry, and history. Some were copies of classical works. Others were original writings by West African scholars. The libraries of Timbuktu were not just repositories of knowledge. They were proof of something larger. They showed that Africa was not silent, that Africa was not without history, that Africa was not waiting for discovery. It was producing, preserving, debating, and innovating. In a world where European chroniclers often dismissed Africa as dark and empty, Timbuktu stood as a radiant contradiction, and Musa's investments had helped make it possible. So what was the real wealth of Mali? It wasn't the nuggets pulled from riverbeds, or the gold dust packed onto camels. It was the manuscripts written in ink, the ideas preserved on parchment, the debates carried out in open courtyards. Knowledge, not gold, was the currency that endured. Consider this. Cairo's markets eventually recovered from Musa's flood of gold. Prices stabilized. The wealth he gave away melted into history. But the manuscripts of Timbuktu survived for centuries. Even when empires fell, when armies burned cities, when colonial powers looted Africa, many of Timbuktu's manuscripts were hidden, buried in chests, preserved by families. They endure even today. The real gold of Musa's Mali was not economic. It was intellectual. And yet, history forgot. When Europeans told the story of Musa, they focused on his wealth. The richest man in history, the king of gold, the one who destabilized Cairo. Rarely did they speak of Timbuktu's scholars. Rarely did they mention the libraries. Rarely did they acknowledge that Mali's greatness was not only in what it owned, but in what it knew. This forgetting was not accidental. Colonial narratives reduced Africa to resources: gold, ivory, slaves, commodities to be extracted. To tell the story of Timbuktu as a center of knowledge would have challenged that narrative. It would have shown Africa not as a passive land to be exploited, but as an active center of global culture. And so the myth of Musa's gold grew, while the truth of his knowledge receded. But why does this matter? Because gold and knowledge represent two different forms of power. Gold dazzles. It buys influence. It impresses in the moment. But it is fleeting. A gift given, a debt repaid, a market destabilized, and it is gone. Knowledge, by contrast, builds. It creates networks of scholars, traditions of learning, generations of students. It sustains beyond the lifespan of one king. Musa may have been remembered for his gold, but he endured through his knowledge. Here lies the irony. Musa likely saw his building projects as acts of faith, of devotion to God. He may not have intended them to be remembered as his greatest legacy, and yet it is in these acts that we see his true impact. The Jengwarebe Mosque still stands. The manuscripts of Timbuktu still exist. Scholars still debate in Mali today. Meanwhile, the gold he gave away is gone. The coins have been melted, the gifts forgotten, the debts erased, the spectacle dazzled, but the books endured. There is a warning here. For our own age, we live in a world obsessed with spectacle. Billionaires racing to space, fortunes flaunted on social media, wealth displayed in yachts and towers. But what will endure? The spectacle or the substance? Mansa Musa's story suggests an answer. The gold fades. The knowledge remains. The true legacy is not what we spend, but what we build. And so we arrive at the twist. The richest man in history was not defined by his gold. He was defined by his books, his mosques, his scholars. But history has misremembered him, reducing him to a caricature of wealth. So we ask, what do we choose to remember? The glitter of gold, or the glow of knowledge? The spectacle that dazzles for a moment, or the legacy that endures for centuries? Mansa Musa's true wealth was never in Cairo's markets. It was in Timbuktu's libraries, and in that truth lies a deeper lesson. That the most valuable treasures are not the ones that shine, but the ones that teach. Mansa Musa died in the mid-14th century. The exact year is debated. Some say 1337, others as late as 1341. His empire endured for a time, but like all empires, Mali eventually declined. The gold that dazzled the world was spent. The scholars who filled Timbuktu's libraries passed into history. The manuscripts endured, yes, but often hidden in chests, buried beneath the dust of neglect, or scattered by war. And yet, centuries later, Mansa Musa's name still lingers, half legend, half myth. The richest man who ever lived. The king who gave so much that Cairo collapsed. The emperor who turned Timbuktu into a jewel of knowledge. But what does his story mean for us today? We live in an era of billionaires. Men and women whose fortunes rival entire nations. Their names fill headlines. Their companies dominate markets. Their rockets pierce the sky. They, like Musa, dazzle. They, like Musa, project power through spectacle. And yet, the question is the same now as it was then. What endures? The yachts, the towers, the space flights, these are gold dust in the wind. They impress, they shock, they inspire envy. But do they last? Or will they vanish like Musa's gold, leaving behind only chaos and memory? Cairo reminds us of the fragility of spectacle. Musa gave generously, but without foresight. His gold destabilized the very economy he sought to honor. Today, we see echoes. Fortunes poured into vanity projects. Markets inflated by unchecked wealth. Entire industries disrupted by a handful of men. Spectacle can inspire, but it can also destabilize. The lesson of Cairo is clear. Wealth without measure can be as destructive as poverty. But Timbuktu tells a different story. There, Musa's wealth was transformed. Gold became stone, manuscripts, knowledge. The mosques endured. The libraries survived. The scholars taught to new generations. This is legacy. Not the glitter that blinds, but the substance that endures. It is a reminder that what matters is not how much wealth we spend, but what we build with it. And here lies the true paradox of Musa's reign. He is remembered for his gold, but his greatness lies in his books. So we ask, what will we leave behind? When future historians look at our age, will they see billionaires in their rockets, corporations with their glowing towers? Fortunes amassed and lost in speculative bubbles? Or will they see knowledge, institutions, ideas, works of culture, and faith that endure beyond us? The mirror of Musa's story reflects back at us. It asks, will we choose spectacle or substance? Will we be remembered for gold or for wisdom? There is one final irony. Mansa Musa sought to glorify God, to elevate Mali, to secure his place in history. He succeeded, but not in the way he might have imagined. The world remembers the gold. It forgets the manuscripts. The world remembers the spectacle. It forgets the substance. And yet, for those who dig deeper, the truth remains. His real legacy was not what he spent, but what he built. Not what glittered, but what endured. Memory simplifies. Legend distorts. But a deeper story remains, waiting to be uncovered. So we leave you with this. What kind of wealth are you building? The kind that dazzles in the moment, like gold spilling through Cairo streets, bright, extravagant, and fleeting? Or the kind that endures, like manuscripts hidden in Timbuktu's libraries, quiet, resilient, and eternal? Because in the end, all wealth becomes dust. But knowledge survives. If stories like this matter to you, if peeling back the myths to find the deeper truths excites you, then stay with us. There are more untold stories, more hidden lessons, more twists in history waiting to be uncovered. Like this video, share it with someone who believes wealth is only measured in gold. And subscribe so you never miss the truths that history tried to bury. Because the story of Mansa Musa isn't just about the past. It's a question for all of us. What shadows will we leave behind?